The following is a presentation of the Steamboat Church of Christ in Steamboat Springs, Colorado.
This morning's reading is a conflation of Matthew 27, 1 through 14, Mark 15, 1 through 3, Luke 23, 1 through 16, and John 18, 28 through 32. Early in the morning, the whole company of them, the chief priests, together with the elders of the people, the scribes, and the whole Sanhedrin, assembled hastily, came to order, and took a formal vote, conspiring to have Jesus put to death. And straightway, we have something interesting. In 1864, the U.S. government passed the Pacific Railway Act, which, along with accompanying legislation, allowed 4 rail companies to sell government-backed bonds in the amount of $100 million, and granted them a right-of-way corridor 400 feet wide and 2,000 miles long, and gave them land grants for sections of land 1 mile in length and 10 miles in width on alternating sides of the track for every mile of track built along the entire length of the corridor. And anyone who lived along that corridor either had to move or had to buy their land back from the railroad. And those who objected had little recourse and very little time to pursue what recourse they did have because of the pace at which construction was being completed. The construction on the new line started as soon as the bill was passed in 1864, and 5 years later, on May 10, 1869, Leland Stanford drove the last spike, the golden spike, into the completed line at Promontory Summit, Utah. And the speed and ease with which this juggernaut plowed its way across the American West gave rise to the expression, to railroad through, meaning to send or put through at high speed or in great haste or hurry or rush unduly. This expression was applied broadly to describe the behavior of any large unstoppable force, power, or popular movement which simply rolls over anyone or anything that gets in its way or attempts to stop it. However, it was primarily used to describe governmental action, and by 1884, the term to railroad was being used chiefly in reference to hasty court proceedings, in the sense of to convict quickly, with little regard for jurisprudence. And if you've ever seen this done, then you know that in order for railroading to be successful, momentum is required. If the race to railroad somebody or something gets interrupted and loses momentum, if the rush to judgment loses its sense of urgency, and those involved have the time to catch their breath and think more soberly, there's a high degree of likelihood that that speeding train will lose steam. And the chief priests, scribes, and the elders of the people understand that fact very well. Not because any of them had ever seen a steam engine, but you don't have to be familiar with locomotives and cabooses to understand what it means to railroad somebody. People have been miscarrying justice for as long as they have been meting it out. And anyone with any political acumen at all knows that one of the keys to manipulating the outcome of a trial is keeping everyone off balance by generating an exaggerated sense of urgency, thus ensuring no loss of momentum. That's why the chief priests held their confab at the crack of dawn and rushed the Lord over to the pretorium. This matter could easily have waited until after the holidays were over. Once Jesus was in custody, there was no need to proceed with the trial at that very hour. However, that very hour was the hour in which the people had been stirred to action. And the chief priests understood how important it is to capitalize on that emotional momentum. They know that they cannot afford to let it slip away, because if they were to have waited till the holidays were over, cooler heads would have prevailed. And that not only would have been the end of their preemptive coup against Jesus, but it also would have exposed the true character of these under-shepherds of the flock of Israel. For though what the chief priests are doing here is actually accomplishing the will of God, that does not appear to be the intent of their hearts. As Joseph said to his brothers in Genesis 50:20, "You intended it for evil against me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." The end does not justify the means. And make no mistake about it, the means being employed here are neither born of righteousness, nor are they being manifested as righteousness. They cannot be, for they are the fruit of bitter trees. James 1:19 through 20, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to listen, but slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Psalm 37:8, "Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. James 4:11, do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. Proverbs 6:16 through 19, there are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that make haste to run to evil, a false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers. Proverbs 19:5, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who breathes out lies will not escape. Returning to our text, they bound him and led him away from the house of Caiaphas to the pretorium. When they delivered him over to Pontius Pilate the governor, they themselves did not enter the pretorium, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Now here first I just want to draw your attention to the fact that according to Matthew 26, 12 hours prior to this, as the sun was setting the night before, Jesus and the apostles shared a meal together, which meal was identified as the Passover. And now, the next day, according to John 18, the chief priests are concerned about keeping themselves holy as they prepare to eat the Passover. And this presents us with an apparent contradiction between the gospel writers. Now, I don't have time today to go into all the details about this. I'll be taking this question on in another lesson soon. For the purposes of today's lesson, just note that this is not something that has escaped the attention of Bible scholars, and when the time comes, we will unravel this knot very carefully and thoroughly. This morning, however, there's another aspect of this passage that I want to bring to your attention, and that is the blatant hypocrisy demonstrated by the chief priests on this occasion. I mean, here they are in the midst of committing the crime of the ages. They're about to crucify the Son of God, and they are doing so on the basis of perjurious testimony which they themselves have suborned, and amid the stench of the residuum of blood money that they themselves paid to Judas. They are wading up to their necks in the filth of their own wickedness, befouled from head to toe with gangrenous sin stains of their own making, and yet they are concerned that if they enter into the pretorium, they will become unclean. Talk about having your priorities out of whack. In 2 Timothy 3:1 through 9, Paul says, but mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. Have nothing to do with such people. They are the kind who worm their way into homes and gain control over gullible women who are loaded down with sins and are swayed by all kinds of evil desires, always learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so also these teachers oppose the truth. They are men of depraved minds who, as far as the faith is concerned, are rejected. But they will not get very far because, as in the case of those men, their folly will be clear to everyone. And in Matthew 23 and following, Jesus said to the chief priests and their colleagues, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Then skipping to verse 29, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started. Jesus knew the heart of a man, and he knew the hearts of these men. And he knew that when the darkness in their hearts turned against him, they would complete what their ancestors had started, just as they are doing before Pilate on this very morning. Returning to our text, so Pilate went outside to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this man subverting our nation and inciting the people to tax rebellion against Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, Are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him in a manner of speaking. Now this calls for some explanation. Suppose that you posted on your Facebook page a comment stating that you had at long last gotten the permit you need to build an addition to your home in spite of the red tape you had to cut through to get it. Now imagine that an archaeologist 2,000 years from now digging up Tel Zuckerman finds your post intact on a long defunct internet server, and he's trying to understand its meaning. Imagine his confusion as he tries to figure out just what red tape was, and why it had the power to prevent you from breaking ground on a construction project. What was this scarlet ribbon? And from whence did this crimson cellophane derive its power? How did this Charisse baton come to be an enemy of the people? And why did this vermilion streamer squander its power on the profitless enterprise of hectoring the common citizenry? No, that scientist would have a very difficult time trying to make sense of your post unless and until he realized that red tape isn't red tape. Rather, red tape is an idiom referring to bureaucratic inefficiency. Well, every language has idioms unique to its setting and culture that must be deciphered before they can be properly translated, before they can be properly understood, because translating them literally doesn't adequately communicate the meaning. I recently saw an interview on YouTube between an Australian newsman, Karl Stefanovic, and the Dalai Lama. And Stefanovic tried to tell the Dalai Lama a joke. The joke ran, the Dalai Lama walked into a pizza parlor and said, "Can you make me one with everything?" Well, needless to say, the humor was lost in translation for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was that the Dalai Lama didn't know what pizza was. And even if he had known, the English idiom, "make me one with everything," translated into Shonga, the language of Tibet, is, "to me, the whole thing is." Well, here in Luke 23:3, the idiom that the Lord uses isn't all that obscure, but it seems to give a lot of trouble to many translators. What Jesus said to Pilate literally in Koine Greek was, "Su leges," you say, which on the face of it is frustratingly unresponsive. And it has always bothered me that so many translations here make it sound like Jesus was being deliberately obtuse, deliberately difficult. Because Pilate would seem to be going out of his way to exculpate Jesus in the eyes of the Sanhedrin, and it has never made sense to me that Jesus would choose this moment to start speaking in non sequiturs. Yet, to Pilate's question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" the King James Version has the Lord responding, "Thou sayest it." The CEB, "That's what you say." The CJB, "The words are yours." The CEV, "Those are your words." The DLNT, "You are saying it." The ESV, "You have said so." And the NRSV, "You say so." And these have always struck me as sounding kind of juvenile, because the tone I hear in these translations is akin to the Lord saying, "I am rubber, you are glue. Whatever you say bounces off of me and sticks to you." But, as I understand the matter, that is not what the idiom "su leges" is intended to communicate. Though the idea in this idiom is more affirming than it is sarcastic. It lies somewhere in between "so you say" and "it is as you say," if you take "so you say" to be meant sincerely, with no rolling of the eyes or sardonic tone in the voice. Thus, what is communicated in the phrase "su leges" is similar to what is evoked in our usage of the phrase "that's what they say," when those words are spoken sincerely and affirmingly. The idea being, that isn't how I would put it, but yes, you've got the right idea. Which is why I've translated the idiom here in a manner of speaking. Because as I understand the Lord here, he does not intend to deny his own sovereignty, his own kingship, and he does not intend to provoke Pilate or to insult him. So even though Pilate's words are not entirely accurate, nevertheless, for the Lord's purposes on this day, they will do. Are you the king of the Jews? In a manner of speaking. Yes, close enough. Back to our text. And the chief priests accused him of many things, but when he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they're bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. And this would seem to be the fulfillment of Isaiah 53:7, He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Returning again to our reading. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. They answered him, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. And I find this very interesting. 2 or 3 years ago, I had the privilege of spending a few hours in the courtroom of Judge Shelley Hill. I had been summoned for jury duty, and because of the sensitive nature of the charges against the defendant, it was a child molestation case, voir dire took a whole day to complete. And during the proceedings to select a jury, the attorneys for the state and for the defendant asked prospective jurors a number of questions. Now, I didn't get the opportunity to say much because I wasn't asked much. I've been through voir dire a number of times, but I've never served on a jury, largely, I think, because as soon as they find out I'm a minister, the prosecution assumes I'll be too soft-hearted, and the defense assumes I'll be too hard-hearted. But as the proceedings went on, and the questions became more poignant, I found it difficult to hold my peace. Not because of anything the lawyers were doing or saying, but because I was astonished and astounded and alarmed at some of the things that were coming out of the mouths of my fellow summonsees. And yes, summonsee is a word, according to the BPTC criminal litigation notes. Because when they were asked whether they would be able to presume the defendant innocent until proven guilty, many of them said flatly no. And some of them even went so far as to say of the defendant, if he hadn't done something wrong, he wouldn't be on trial. And I so wanted to raise my hand and say, what is the matter with you people? Did you not take civics in high school? Have you never seen or read To Kill a Mockingbird? Are you completely unfamiliar with the writings of our founding fathers? The presumption of innocence is one of the basic cornerstones of civil rights in the United States. For crying out loud, God help you scapegraces if any of you ever find yourself sitting in the defendant's chair. But discretion being the better part of valor, I said none of these things, even though I was appalled. Indeed, frankly, I was ashamed that so many of my fellow citizens were either ignorant of this foundation stone of our society or were willing to set it aside when the stakes were high. And I was astounded that they were willing to testify to the same without any discernible sense of shame or guilt. And I'm flabbergasted, frankly, that the chief priests were willing to go on record with a statement as cynical as the one they make in John 18:30, when they say, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. Now, you may think that it's unfair for me to evaluate this statement on the basis of a value of the Enlightenment, a value that would have been foreign to the culture of Roman-occupied first-century Palestine. But, beloved, the juris ethic of the presumption of innocence is not a product of the Enlightenment. It has been around for a very long time. Certainly it would have been known to Pilate as a magistrate of Roman law. The 6th century Digest of Justinian offers as one of its general rules of evidence the maxim e incumbit probatio qui dicit non qui negat, which is Latin for proof lies on him who asserts, not him who denies. And Justinian attributes the quote to 2nd century Roman jurist Julius Paulus Prudentissimus, demonstrating that the presumption of innocence was a codified feature of Roman law from very early on. But the principle of the presumption of innocence is actually much older, even than that. After the fall of Rome, Europe descended into feudalism, and over the course of the next 500 years or so, most European courts abandoned Roman law in favor of trial by ordeal. But starting in about the 12th century, the courts of medieval Europe, particularly in southern Europe, began to adopt the tenets of the Ordo Judiciarius, a system of law whose rules of evidence were established by the jurist of common law, jus commune, a system of common law which is based on Roman law. And one of the tenets of this system of law was the presumption of the innocence of the accused. However, as these principles of law were being reintroduced into European courts, there was a great deal of resistance against the implementation of these rules of evidence, based in large part on general suspicion and distaste for all things Roman. After all, the Roman Empire did die with a whimper, following a long decline and descent into depravity and dissipation. So jurists who wanted to introduce these principles into courts of law had to find some other basis on which to argue for them. a source that was more palatable to judges, juries, defendants, and the general public than was Roman law. And the source that they turned to was the Bible. One jurist, Pontius, in his commentary on Gratian's Decretum, argued that the Ordo Judiciaris originated in the Garden of Eden when Adam pleaded not guilty to the Lord's accusation of wrongdoing. After all, Pontius urged, even though the Lord is omniscient, knowing all things, in Genesis 3:9-13, he did not pass summary judgment, but called all the available witnesses and heard their testimony before deciding the case. Pontius' point is subtle, but it was not to be lost on later jurists. Although God is omniscient, he too must summon defendants and hear their pleas. In addition, Pontius argued that this principle of evidence is reflected in the law of Moses. In Deuteronomy 19:15, the law states, "One witness is not enough to convict anyone accused of any crime or offense they may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses." And as a safeguard against false testimony, the law goes on. If a malicious witness takes the stand to accuse someone of a crime, the 2 people involved in the dispute must stand in the presence of the Lord before the priests and the judges who are in office at the time. The judges must make a thorough investigation, and if the witness proves to be a liar, giving false testimony against a fellow Israelite, then do to the false witness as that witness intended to do to the other party. You must purge this evil from among you. The rest of the people will hear of this and shall thenceforth be deterred from committing any such evil among you. So show no pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. So, as Pontius argued, just as God must summon litigants to defend themselves, the law of God also requires humans to summon witnesses and to hear evidence and to presume that every defendant is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Now, Pontius postdates Caiaphas by more than 1,000 years, so Caiaphas couldn't possibly have been familiar with his work. But don't miss the point. All of the source material available to Pontius was also available to Caiaphas. And as high priest, he ought to have understood that the accused stand innocent in the eyes of the law until proven guilty. Jeremiah 9:23-24, "Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast in his might. Let not the rich man boast in his riches. But let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who practices steadfast love, justice, and righteousness on the earth. For in these things I take delight, declares the Lord." Leviticus 19:15, "You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great. But in righteousness you shall judge your neighbor." Proverbs 25:26, "Like a muddied spring or a polluted fountain is a righteous man who gives way before the wicked." Proverbs 21:15, "When justice is done, it is a joy to the righteous, but terror to evildoers." Amos 5:24, "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Isaiah 30:18, "Therefore the Lord waits to be gracious to you, and therefore he exalts himself to show mercy to you. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for him." Micah 6:8, "He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." Isaiah 1:17, "Learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause." Beloved, the Lord puts a high premium on justice. And one of the tenets of biblical justice is the principle that the accused are to be considered innocent unless and until they are proven guilty. Returning to our text, Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. And here I just want to note that the claim made by the Jewish leaders that it was not lawful for them to put anyone to death is accurate but not truthful. It is true that the Romans granted only limited self-rule to the Jews in first century Palestine. They could mete out justice according to their own law, but they did not have the authority to carry out sentences of capital crimes. However, it is completely disingenuous for them to appeal to that restriction here, because while it may not have been lawful for them to execute capital offenders, that did not stop them from doing so when it suited them. They were perfectly willing to stone the woman caught in adultery in John 8. They were perfectly willing to stone Stephen to death in Acts 7. They were perfectly willing to attempt to execute Jesus by pushing him from a great height in Luke 4. They were perfectly willing to take up stones against Jesus in John 8 and again in John 10. They were perfectly willing to stone Paul to death in Acts 14. So it's awfully convenient for them here to beg off responsibility for this execution by appealing to their sense of propriety in honoring this law. Back to our text. And they persisted urgently, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea from Galilee even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. Now, this we will talk about at greater length in another lesson soon. But for the purposes of today's lesson, it's worth noting that from what is reported to us in the Gospels, it appears that Pontius Pilate did not want to be responsible for the Lord's life or the shedding of his blood. In the Gospel accounts, it looks very much as if Pilate was a reluctant judge. For as soon as he got the opportunity, he called for a change of venue and sent the Lord and his accusers to Herod. But Pilate may not be quite the victim of circumstance that he seems to be in most portrayals of him. As our reading continues with Luke 23:8 and following, "When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but Jesus made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, dressing him in full regalia, they sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before this they had been at odds with one another." Now, this brings us to the end of our time for this morning, but we're only about a third of the way through the trial before Pontius Pilate. Not only that, but though I have not developed it yet, I've just introduced a new topic into the discussion, the question of the actual role of Pilate in the death of Jesus. Because in the midst of all the people involved in the prosecution of Jesus, Judas, Annas, Caiaphas, the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, the elders of the people, and the crowd, there stands one figure who is sympathetic, one player whose character is actually fleshed out by the gospel writers, one person who actually seems to have a functioning conscience. And that figure, that player, that person is Pontius Pilate. Because throughout the proceedings of this trial, he stands alone as the only figure with earthly authority who seems to give a care about Jesus' civil rights or his human rights. Pilate is the only player in this grand drama who seems to have any real desire to investigate the charges against Jesus and ferret out the truth of the matter. And because of this, in every sermon I've ever heard on Pilate, in every Bible class in which he has been discussed, in every movie I've ever seen depicting the events of this trial, Pilate has always been portrayed very sympathetically. He's always presented as a good public servant, with good intentions, and with a basically good heart, who never sought to do any harm to Jesus, but who found himself between a rock and a hard place, forced to choose between doing harm to himself or doing harm to Jesus. And out of a sense of self-preservation, he chose the latter, and for this crime wound up on the wrong side of history. But he did so without malice, and for this reason Bible scholars, theologians, and ministers have been trying to snatch him from the fires of history, working diligently to rehabilitate his character in an ongoing attempt to spare him from being vilified as the others have been vilified. And you can count me among that number, because every time I've taught on this text, I've spoken in defense of Pilate, urging my brothers and sisters in Christ to tread lightly whenever he's under scrutiny. But Luke 23:12 throws something of a monkey wrench into that juris ethic, because there we are told, "And Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before this they had been at odds with one another." And this raises a serious question. On what exactly was the friendship between Herod and Pilate based? And in what fellowship was their friendship sustained? What does it mean that Herod and Pilate became friends? And what bearing should the forging of that friendship have on our historical assessment of Pilate? Come back next week, and I'll tell you. That's my lesson for today.
This has been a presentation of the Steamboat Church of Christ. May the grace and peace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you.